everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and welcome back to another episode of Games I Wish Got Fan Translated, Part 15. Yeah, apparently we're still making these, but I'm perfectly okay with that, because this is a series I do really enjoy. As I have a lot of fun trying to talk about these super obscure games that look really interesting to me that hopefully one day might be playable in English. And as I always say in these videos, as I've done it like 15 times at this point, is that yes, I don't expect any of these to happen anytime soon, as working on fan translations are very difficult, and even if none of these happen in our lifetime, it's really just for fun wishful thinking. That's really all it is at the end of the day, but if any of them do happen though, then hey, always cool. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first game we're going to be talking about here is a PS1 game. Of course it is, because there's like 50 million of them in Japan, and that happens to be Belfareth? Or Belfareth? I don't know how this one is said, and I'm sure someone's gonna get mad about it. Well anyways, so this is an action RPG that happens to have some dating sim elements, which by today's standards, that seems pretty common that a lot of them have this sort of stuff, but back in the day, it mostly seemed like you got either just straight up visual novels, or turn-based RPGs, or strategy tactical games. But as for action RPGs with these sort of elements, there was not that many of them. There was a couple, but not a lot. And it has a really nice 2D art style, and I really like the character art portraits. The art style looks very familiar to me, but I can't really think of who it is at the moment. I also couldn't find out exactly who did it. And the music, from what I heard, is also really good too, and it is uploaded to YouTube, which is nice. And one crazy thing to me is that this game is actually a Sony published game. Yeah, it's kind of funny that in recent years I've been discovering so many of these random ass games that Sony has been involved with, but yet they've been completely forgotten about. Sony probably doesn't even remember even doing them. So that's all I can really say about this one, but yeah, I think it actually looks really cool. And the next one we're going to be talking about here is on the PC-98, and that happens to be Paracelis Nomin? Yeah, probably not right either, but oh well. So this game is developed by Hummingbird Soft, and it happens to be yet another horror-themed RPG. For this one, you play as a group of detectives that are trying to solve a murder set in Europe. So not only does it have a pretty cool setting for an RPG, but also no surprise, but yes, I freaking love the way how this game looks. I love the UI, love the character designs, love all like the different pixel art graphics. And in some ways, it does kind of give me a little bit of Tokyo Twilight Buster vibes, which is not a bad thing at all, because that's another game that I played through recently that I liked. So if you really like detective RPGs, then there is a good chance that you might be really into this one. And next up we got here is a PS2 game, and this one is actually in the same series as another game that I talked about in an older episode, and that happens to be the Gun Parade March. Yeah, there's actually quite a few games in this series that all look really interesting, but this time we're going to be talking about the one on the PS2, which is Gun Parade Orchestra Shirro no Sho. So this game came out in 2006, so it's a fairly late release on PS2, and it was developed by Alpha System, and as again, published by Sony. And for those that may not know or remember, but Gun Parade March was a video game that got eventually turned into an anime series, but most people outside of Japan are more familiar with the anime. It's a very similar situation as Nightwalker Midnight Detective, where that was a video game that got turned into an anime, but most people outside of Japan know more about the anime since, you know, it actually came out over there. So this one does look pretty similar to the first game, where it has some really good looking pre-rendered backgrounds with some nice character models. So it is mostly an adventure game, but apparently does have some action parts, and unfortunately I could not find any gameplay footage whatsoever of this game, so I don't know fully on how the action parts work, but judging by these screenshots, it almost looks like a prototype version of Valkyria Chronicles, and if it plays anything like that, then I'm totally down with it. And I wish I could talk a little more about this game, but I still haven't even seen the anime for it yet, but maybe I should do that soon, as it always did look like a really cool looking one ever since I first discovered these games. But I can definitely say for sure that when it comes to these like pre-rendered graphic games on PS2, this is probably one of my favorite looking ones. It's just very aesthetically pleasing to me. And next up here we got another PS1 game, and this one is called Sonata. And no, not to be confused with Eternal Sonata. I guess you could say this is the prequel. So anyways, this is a turn-based RPG that has a futuristic setting, which looks really cool. I actually really like the backgrounds in this game a lot too. And from the bit of music I heard, it's also really damn good as well. There's a lot of really nice sounding techno in here. But yeah, from all I know about the story, from what I can find, is that apparently you and your girlfriend went to a movie theater, and then while watching the movie, you end up getting teleported to a whole other world. So yeah, it's like an ikigai, but of course, before all that shit got popular. And it is also interesting to note that all the battle commands in this game are all done with button prompts on the D-pad, which is something I've noticed a lot more newer RPGs are doing, so hey, this game was actually kind of ahead of its time in that aspect. So yeah, that's all I can say about this one. It looks like a neat little sci-fi RPG. Now as for the next game we're talking about here, this one's on a bunch of different systems, but this one has a really badass name, and it happens to be Deathbringer. Or some versions of the game also call it Deathbringer, the Night of Darkness, and when you put together that with the cover art of this game, yeah, it's some badass looking shit, and I love it. So this is a first-person dungeon crawler that was published by Telenet, so as you would expect, it was developed by Riot and Renovation Games, so that's pretty dope. And the releases of this game are the PC-88, the PC-98, the Sharp 68000, the PC Engine CD, and the Sega CD. And all these versions do look really cool in their own way, but personally I love the Sharp 68000 and the Sega CD version the most. And one interesting difference I noticed with this game compared to many others in the same style is that exploring the dungeon is in first person with the whole 3D aspect, but when you go into battles, it then goes to top-down view. So I do kinda like that aspect. And one amusing thing I can mention is that apparently this game is very similar to another game with the same frickin' name, and that happens to be Deathbringer on DOS. Yeah, they're unrelated, but the fact that there's two games that are pretty similar to each other and happen to have the same name is just craziness. But this Japanese one that I'm talking about here came out 1 year before the first version of that game. So if you want a really badass looking first person dungeon crawler that does take some elements of some Western RPGs at the time, then you might really like this one. And this next one here is going to be a PS2 game, and it's a pretty weird looking one, but I figured I'd mention it because it is kind of amusing looking, and that happens to be Dual Savior Destiny. So this is an action RPG, and it was developed by Giga. Uh-oh, that's a company I've had some very mixed results with over the years. But to give them credit, one game that they did work on that I did kinda like was the game Briganti: The Root of Darkness on PC-98. And this game right here is very similar to that one, where it is also kinda like a beat-em-up RPG, so there is a chance that I might actually like this one. And yeah, kind of like what I said about the game Sonata, this is another game that has to do the whole, oh, a guy gets teleported to a whole other world, and in this new world he happens to like meet up with a bunch of girls. And if you know anything about the games that Giga has been a part of, then yes, you know that this game is gonna have a lot of fan service stuff. But I will say though, I do like the game's background graphics, and some of the character designs are kinda nice too. Although the in-game sprites are all done with chibis, which are not my most favorite looking ever. But everything else does look more than good enough for me, so it's all good. But yeah, I was just shocked to find out that Giga made a game on PS2, because I thought after the Dreamcast came out, they pretty much just gave up with making console games and just made straight up visual novels on PC. And even with my very mixed experience with the company Giga's work, I did like the Root of Darkness game, and I also do like Variable Geo 2. But there's a lot of other ones I tried that were a little crappy, so who knows. Hopefully this one will be one of the good ones. And the next one we're going to be talking about here is not going to be one game, instead it's going to be a series of games, and that happens to be the Jake Hunter series. So this is a series of point-and-click adventure games, or even a little bit of visual novel, where it stars the main character, Jake Hunter, and he is a private investigator. Now, for those that are familiar with the series, you probably might remember that there was 2 on the DS, and then there is 1 on the 3DS that came out over here. And there's quite a few different games in this series that were Japan only, and they go pretty far back, all the way to the NES days. So it was pretty fun to learn that this series is much older than I was expecting. And honestly, I'd be perfectly happy with any version of these games getting fan translated in some way, shape, or form. But if there is one game in the series that does look the coolest to me, that would have to be the 2 that were released on PS2, and those were Innocent Black and Kind Blue. I really love the way the art style looks in these 2 games, but they are much later entries in the series, obviously, so yeah, I don't know if you really need to play these in order or not, but for anyone out there that has played any of these games before, well, feel free to let me know, as this is a series that I've always wanted to get into, but just never got around to it. And the next one we have here is on the Super Nintendo. It's always cool to find yet another Super Nintendo game that hasn't been done yet. and that happens to be Dark Kingdom. And wow, look at that cover art, that is just badass looking. So this game came out in 1994, and it was published by Telenet. Seems like I've been finding a lot of interesting Telenet games lately. So it does look like a pretty typical turn-based RPG with a fantasy setting, but of course, just like the name suggests, it's a lot darker. So apparently you play as a mercenary named Gene, and instead of helping out the kingdom that he comes from, he ends up siding with the Demon King. And from there he gets many monsters joining in on the party, and they have to complete missions that usually revolves around destroying the kingdom that he came from. So some of these ideas do kind of remind me of another Super Nintendo game that was Japan only called Dark Half, and that's a game I do have to try again, as it's one of those games that's pretty difficult to know what you're doing without a guide, so hopefully this one maybe might be easier, who knows, maybe it could be harder. But it's still a really cool idea for a game, and of course I really do like the way how this game looks, and the music is also really good too from what I've heard. So yeah, this was yet another cool looking dark Super Nintendo game that I would like to try out one day. And next we have yet another PS1 RPG, and that happens to be Ore no Shikabane. Yeah, look at this cover art with this kid that's just staring into your soul. Very unsettling. So this game has a pretty interesting story where it's about this family who gets cursed where their lives are cut short and they can't have children. So then they have to go on a quest to try to kill Shuten Doji. Now that's all I can really say about the story, but apparently there is some gameplay aspects that do make sense with this whole story thing. For an example, apparently the game has a job class system that works pretty differently than most. Like, certain job classes depends on what day that the characters were born. And just like the game Linda Cube, apparently this game does go into some pretty dark stuff, which I'm quite fascinated to learn more about. And on top of that too, this game also does have quite a bit of a cult status in Japan. Like, there was a remake on the PSP, and there was even a sequel that was on the Vita. And apparently the sequel actually came out over here, and it's called Orchestra Tainted Bloodlines. And as someone that did own a Vita when it was still new, this is one that I'm kind of surprised I didn't really know much about when it came out. But I'm definitely going to have to play it at some point soon. But with this original one getting fan translated, or even the PSP version, whichever one, I'm perfectly cool with any of them, as it does look like a pretty fascinating game. And now moving on to the last one, and this one right here is a game on the 3DS, and it's a game that I actually played for the very first time recently, and that happens to be Geist Crusher. And then there's the sequel, Geist Crusher God. So this is a 3D beat 'em up where you play as this guy who kind of looks a little bit like a mixture of Saint Seiya meets, I don't know, one of the guys from Ronin Warriors. And not only can you beat up enemies with your fists, but you can also beat them up with your giant-ass sword, and there's also other characters you can play as well. And from the bit I played, the controls seem to be pretty impressively well done for a 3DS game, and it does seem to be fairly playable without knowing Japanese, but of course it would be nice to know what the story's all about, or what all the menus are. But I still found it to be pretty enjoyable, and it was published by Capcom, and you wanna know who developed this game? It was Treasure. Yeah, even to this day, this is the very last game that Treasure has developed. And apparently the company is still around, so I don't know how they're keeping afloat without putting on any games. But even if this does end up being the very last game they ever developed though, they still got a lot of variety of very interesting games. And these two Geist Crusher games, I'm definitely going to play more of for sure. Alright, so that is 10 games that I mentioned for this episode, and normally I would call it there, but before we do, I do want to mention one more game because it's one that I think would be kind of funny to see get made, and that happens to be Side Pocket 3. Now I know you're all thinking, really? A frickin' pool game? Like, have you finally run out of ideas yet? Nah, I still got a few more up my sleeve. But the reason I bring this game up is because this game, surprisingly, has a story mode in it. And in the story mode, you go inside a fancy mansion, you walk around almost looking like a survival horror game at the time, but instead of running into zombies trying to kill you, you instead have to challenge people of playing pool. I don't know, there's just something about that, it's just so amusing to me, and I won't lie, I actually really love the way the mansion looks in this mode, so I do think that is actually really cool, but yeah, like I said, nothing's too crazy about it there, I just really wanted to mention this game because, well, I don't know who the hell else is talking about it. So there you go, that's your bonus one. So yes, that will be it for today's episode of Games I Wish Got Fan Translated. As always, what are some games that you wish got fan translated, whether it be ones I mentioned or didn't mention throughout the video? videos. And if any of these games have any interest to you, or if you know anything else about them, then yeah, feel free to let me know. So, as always, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.